Now for a look at the objectives of the AU Summit, which is due to take place this weekend. For this discussion, we are joined by Keith Gottschalk. He's a political analyst from the University of the Western Cape. Keith, thank you so much for being with us today. Interesting outfit, as we were saying. You said our Ghanaian viewers would appreciate that. But I want to pick up on the point about the objectives. We understand, of course, that the theme is, of course, an emphasis on empowering women, that Africa 2063 agenda is also there in the line. But what are the objectives of this particular summit?
I imagine that one of their objectives is going to be the third-termism problem of African presidents who all want to be presidents for life, and this will require tough talking face-to-face by President Zuma and others to put some countervailing pressure on them. Another objective is always to project to Africa some unified bargaining stand in global governance, such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the latest book out, the African Union's Africa, is quite path-breaking in what he says about that theme. And the third major theme of interest, in particular to business viewers, is the drive towards the tripartite free trade area as a stepping stone to a continental free trade area.
Yeah.
Keith, I've got just to take up on the last point that you made there on the Continental Trade Pact. If we could actually move towards that, it would put Africa in a whole new context. Instead of 60-odd countries, we could have one trading union. And we think of the value of that, to take the combined GDP, the combined foreign trade that could be marshaled here, the combined resources that they have. It's about time that the African Union said, let's operate together as one trading union rather than as diverse ones. And do you think there's much chance, or a good chance, of them moving in this direction? Because it would be to the benefit of all of the continental participants.
You spot on there. If all 50 states in the USA levied customs duties against each other, America would just drop off all the charts. It's now 52 years since Kwame Nkrumah pleaded for a continental common market, and the first stepping stone towards a common market is a free trade area from Cape to Cairo. Realistically, I imagine that after all the treaties are signed, it will take about a decade before we'll get the 26 states between Cape Town to Cairo to have lifted tariffs on, let's say, 80% of their goods and 80% of them there. I've seen a study that argues that when we advance to a continental free trade area, it will boost trade between African countries by 1/3, which is spectacular for the gross domestic product. It will be spectacular for creating jobs and the GDP.
Keith, staying on the money somewhat, we know that the African Union pretty much, still relies heavily on the developed world in terms of funding its programs. I mean, from the research that you've been doing, and I don't know, will we perhaps see, some refreshing views coming out of this summit, Africa starting to gather its own capital to fund its own programs?
If I'm right, at the moment, South Africa is the biggest contributor of capital and development in the other African countries. But certainly, African presidents long need to put their money where their mouth is and to pay up the annual membership fees of the African Union, the Southern African Development Community, and all the others. It's in 2006 that the governments of the big ones with the big GDPs, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Libya, and Algeria, agreed to pay up 3/4 of the African states' budget in addition to their own annual membership fees to make up for all the lazy ones which are not paying their budget. There's no excuse for that, because the typical African country's membership fees is less than buying a new Mercedes for each member of the cabinet, and they do need to put pressure on them to suspend governments that don't pay. Our bank's ruling is that if you miss out 2 months on your hire purchase, there's going to be a phone call and a knock on the door, and the African Union does need to say, if you're more than 2 months behind with your membership fees, you're suspended.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the reason I asked that as well is because, then the question comes in, when the African Union, draws out plans to intervene in places like Burundi, my memory goes back to Libya when the African Union had a plan, and of course the West came in and took over in that scenario. If we're taking money from these people, can we then really be independent about the plans that we want to roll out? So I guess what I want to know here is, what is your sense of the independence of the African Union? Taking a walk down the road and asking a few people aren't really familiar with the African Union. These are people from Africa. They don't really resonate with the body and what it actually does. So can we perhaps talk to the relevance of the African Union, the discussions that they have? I mean, you talked about the fact that they're discussing third terms of presidents, but the reality is it's happening all across the continent. You've got the likes of Robert Mugabe who will be in attendance. So, I mean, is this more than a talk shop, Keith?
I would argue that the African Union has achieved vastly more than its contemporaries, such as the Arab League, the Organization of American States. It's currently got 75,000 soldiers and police on peace enforcing duties in a whole range of countries from Somalia to Mali. That's not even contemplated by the Arab League or the others. Only the European Union is ahead of the African Union, and it of course has a budget 500 times biggest. You touched on two key issues here. The one is donor dependency, and I would argue there that what Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma should lobby for is that each government adds a 0.1% Pan-African surcharge onto all its taxes, and that will cover the dues to both the African Union and its peacekeeping programs to end donor dependency, and it will also cover the annual dues to your regional body, such as the SADC or the East African community. On that, the second big problem you touched is elitism. Pan-African commitment is an ideology at the moment limited to a tiny elite of intellectuals and top government officials in the Department of International Relations. Maybe 5,000 out of 50 million South Africans are passionate about Pan-Africanism. And there, what we need to do is for South Africa to take the lead into being the first to have direct elections for its 5 MPs in the Pan-African Parliament. You simply add a third paper onto our general elections, and when the new parliament or the PAP convenes, those MPs are called up. There also needs to be the same thing as anyone who's visited France, Germany, Italy knows. Everywhere the national flag is flown, side by side is the European Union flag. And what we need to see in South Africa and other African countries is the AU flag flying side by side with the national flag on every occasion, 365 days a year, that the national flag is flown. And this will help popularize the necessity of Pan-African and African integration economically and politically.
All right, Keith, that was Keith Gottschalk, political analyst from the University of the Western Cape.